They have nothing. They're a hospital ship. They're non-combatant.
So that when they saw the plane coming, there really was nothing they could have done.
No. Actually, they hit him at night. The ship was lighted. And so that's why the pilot used the Red Cross as a target.
You're listening to the Stories Behind the Stars podcast, and I'm your host, Tatiana Fallon. This podcast is run by the organization Stories Behind the Stars. We have the goal of writing a story for every American service member killed during World War II. That's over 420,000. We are accomplishing this goal through amazing volunteers who you will hear in this podcast as they research and write these stories. If you're at all interested in becoming a volunteer and researching and writing these stories, please check us out at storiesbehindthestars.org. Thank you so much for your time, and I hope you enjoy this amazing content that we're finding. In March, we celebrate Women's History Month, so we thought it was completely fitting to have us highlight some of the women who were killed in World War II. And today's episode, I have the opportunity to speak with researcher and author John Strupp. He recently completed writing all the profiles for the women killed on the USS Comfort, which was a Navy hospital ship. It's quite a compelling story, and obviously tragic, but very inspiring as well. So we hope that you enjoy this episode. Just a few things to be aware of. If you're interested in learning more about these women and the lives that they lived, you can check out each one of their profiles. There will be a link in the description to fold 3 to read their entire stories. And then you can also, if you're interested in learning more about John and his work, there will be a link to his book that you can check out. Do us a huge favor and share this with those that you love and think would enjoy listening to these inspiring stories. It's quite a lot of work that John's put into these stories. They're really well done and definitely worth looking into. Thank you for your time. Well, you've been on the podcast before, but for our new listeners, would you just introduce yourself, tell us a little about what you do, why you're doing this project, and what brought you to the Stories Behind the Stars?
Okay, well, my name is John Strupp, and I got involved with Stories Behind the Stars. I did a podcast last April talking about some of the profiles that I've done over the years from various projects. Wrote a book about the ship my dad was on in World War II. The title of the book is King of the Oilers, the story of the USS Chiwawa AO-68. It was a fleet oiler during World War II. My dad was on it for 2.5 years, and the ship is still floating. It's an ore boat on the Great Lakes now. So I follow that, and what brought me into the project was Don Milne had contacted me about when he was doing his feature with the 100th birthday project. There was a local man that was killed at Pearl Harbor, was Ira Jeffrey. And so he was going to do a feature on Ira, and I had done a Find a Grave page. And so he had contacted me on that. And then as that evolved into the Stories Behind the Stars, I was invited to do a podcast last April. And so now I'm back, and I'm happy to be here. And hello to everyone. And if you're a veteran, thank you for your service. So what I had done, I had done profiles on 22 men. And so then I looked at a woman who was killed on active duty. The first wave to die on active duty was Elizabeth Kerensky, and she died in November of 1943, I think. Don't remember the month, but there was a
just real
mishandling.
Just real quick to clarify, what's a wave for our listeners?
Oh, wave is the women's department of the Navy. They were women. It was an acronym: Women Accepted for Volunteer Emergency Service. So Elizabeth was on a base in Norfolk, Virginia, and there was an accident, mishandled ordnance, and it exploded, and killed, I think, 26, 28 people. And unfortunately, they were right before lunch, and all these sailors were going to lunch, and when this happened. And so she died. I think she wasn't in the Navy very long. And I think she was a seaman second class. So she had just only been in the Navy a few months. And so I started researching her, and I found that researching women was difficult and more challenging than researching men, because women were not considered the same as men. It was not a typical career path at the time. I've talked to Lee Schneider, and we had a discussion about, well, why would women join the military? This was not a traditional path for women. And so Lee helped me find some information. There wasn't a lot out there on her. So we did put together a page. And so I decided I wanted to do more women. And so I got involved with the story of the USS Comfort and the 6 nurses who were killed when a Japanese suicide plane dove into the ship and hit the surgical ward, used the Red Cross on the ship as a target, and hit the surgical ward while surgery was being conducted about 50 miles from Okinawa on April 28th, 1945. So there were 7 nurses in the surgery ward, and 6 of them were killed. So my connection to the Comfort is that the first commanding officer of the Comfort was Harold F. Foltz, who was also the first commanding officer of my dad's ship, the USS Chiwawa. So that's what attracted me, because I was a connection from Harold, and this tragedy that happened. And it's a story that's has a lot of, there's a great backstory to it. There's a wonderful website done by one of the other nurses, Doris Gardner. There was a book called Too Close for Comfort, written by Dale Harper. That was a good source, had lots of pictures of the nurses in there. I don't know where he got them, but he got them. So there was some great resources out there. But once you start looking at the nurses themselves, it's a little different, because women change names, they get married. These nurses varied in age, all from their 40s to their 20s. Some of them had established nursing careers. And so why would you join the military when you already have an established nursing career? And I didn't really find a reason why in any of the research, none of the newspaper articles said they joined the Army for a particular reason.
Just real quick, what kind of ship was the Comfort?
The Comfort was a hospital ship, so it was a non-combatant.
So it was a Navy hospital ship, so it wasn't like a Red Cross ship.
No,
but
it was
the Red Cross was using it, or
no. This was well, I can get into that a little bit, because this was a U.S. Navy ship, and this is the first time it was tried that the ship itself was run by the Navy, but the medical department was run by the Army. So the Hope and the Mercy were also run this way. So the Comfort, the Hope, and the Mercy were run as in this configuration. So I guess I'm going to get off on a small tangent here. My wife is a Navy nurse. She was part of the Navy Nurse Corps in the 1990s. And so women are a bit overlooked in general. We go through it in our day-to-day lives. We will be walking someplace, and obviously I'm a military historian, and I'll start talking military, and they ask me when I served, when my wife is standing right next to me. I never served a day. And they just assume that she never served. And I'd say, I never served a day, but she did.
Wow. I bet their look is on their face is like, what?
Yeah. They get a shocked look on their face, and it's like, oh, okay. So that's another reason that attracted me to this. I think we need to bring attention to that women do serve, and make that a little more, bring that to light more. So if you want me to, I can do a brief overview of each nurse if you'd like.
Yeah, sorry, I derailed you. You were talking about you were about to talk about the nurses and what brought them to being in the Navy, and I just derailed you because I was a little confused. I didn't realize that we had Navy hospital ships that were that's kind of a cool aspect of the war. I mean, it makes sense, like what you need the hospital, so why not put them on the ship, make them mobile? So,
yeah, they have to be mobile. They have to bring the care to where the care is needed. And one thing I do want to point out about these, and what my wife said, her mission is to not inflict suffering but relieve it. So these are non-combatants. They're not trained to inflict suffering. They're trained to relieve it. That's their mission. So that's one thing my wife and I talked about. But so I can get into a brief overview of each nurse if you'd like.
Yeah, that would be awesome. Love to hear those 6 stories. Yeah.
So the first nurse I have is Florence Taylor Grewer, and when I said researching her was a little bit harder because she was married, and then she changed for the Army. She changed her middle name to be her maiden name, which it's kind of strange why she would do that, and I could not find her original middle name. So on all of her armor paperwork, she's Florence T Gruber, or Grewer, I'm sorry. So she was born in 1902. So when she died, she was 43. So she had an established nursing career. She was born in Foreman, North Dakota. And she was the youngest of 3 sisters. And her father died in 1919. So her father died when she was 17. And she went to nurses training at Northwestern Hospital in Minneapolis. And she married Paul H. Grewer, and who was a dentist when she was 22 years old. I could not find their marriage date. And they adopted a son, and he went by his middle name. His name was Douglas Paul Grewer, but he went by Paul. He was born in 1930, and then she divorced her husband, moved to Seattle to live with her sister, Mildred, and then she lived with her sister for about 6 months, and then she moved to Longview, Washington, where she was a superintendent of nursing at Longview General Hospital, and which was also known as Colwitz General Hospital. Florence enlisted in the Army on October 10th, 1942 at Seattle, Washington, and eventually she volunteered for hospital ship duty and received training at Camp Stoneman, California, and additional operational training at the Station Hospital at Torrance, California. All 6 of these nurses were part of the original crew of the Comfort. So they all went through the same training at the same time together. So I'm not going to repeat all of the training stuff that they went through with each one. So so this ship was in the Pacific Theater. It was commissioned on May 5th, 1944 at Terminal Island, California, and made stops in Australia and a couple of other places. And then in Christmas of 1944, the ship came back to California for some maintenance work and to give the crew a break. Some of the nurses did get to see their families at Christmas. Bob Hope came aboard with Francis Langford, and they put on a show, which was kind of interesting. So Florence, when she died, she held the rank of first lieutenant. Her family was notified of her death on May 10th, 1945, and she's buried in Arlington National Cemetery. So that kind of 2 of these nurses are buried at Arlington, so that kind of ties in with your Arlington project. So I was happy to help out with that, kind of kill 2 birds with 1 stone.
That's amazing. So she was a lieutenant, so that's pretty high ranking, right? I mean,
it's Army and Navy. You have to remember their rankings work a little differently.
Yeah.
So a first lieutenant second lieutenant is the lowest officer, the next step up is first lieutenant, and then a captain, and then a major, lieutenant colonel, and a general. So that's the pecking order. In the Navy, it's an ensign, and you're lieutenant JG, and a full lieutenant, and then lieutenant commander, and then the captain. You get that? So that's the pecking order in the Navy. So a captain in the Army is completely different from a captain in the Navy.
Yeah, that's going to be confusing if you're not familiar with that. But she was in the Army, but in the Navy, on a Navy
Well, she was
ship.
on a Navy ship. So the medical operation was run by the Army, and the actual ship itself, all of the functions of navigation and the engine room and all of the functions on the ship were run by the Navy. So so the next nurse is her name was Frances O Chesley. She was born on October 24th, 1910 in Fort Fairfield, Maine. She had a brother, Lloyd. She graduated from Presque Isle, Maine High School in 1928. She worked at the New England Baptist Hospital in Boston, where she received her nursing degree, and worked at Long Island Beckham Street Hospital, the Leahy Clinic, and John D. Rockefeller Hospital in Colombia, South America, for 3 years before enlisting in the Army on May 1st, 1943. And after that, she was stationed at Fort Devens and Camp Miles Standish. And then she went through the same process. She was in charge of the surgical ward at the time of the attack, and she held the rank of second lieutenant at the time of her death. She was the first woman from Maine to die on active duty in World War II. Initially buried on Guam, her remains were removed to the Pine Grove Cemetery in Portland, Maine in May of 1948. The next nurse is Margaret M Billings, and I got help from Lee Schneider with this, so I want to give her a thank you for her help with this. So Margaret was born on April 16th, 1910, and she graduated from Everett High School in 1928, and then she held a job as a clerk. And I think she went into accounting for a while and then decided to go to nursing school. I'm just looking at my notes here. I'm sorry. She enlisted in the Army in April of 1942 and went through the same process. And she was able to see her family for the 1944 Christmas holiday when the ship arrived in San Pedro, California. She held the rank of second lieutenant at the time of her death, and she's buried in Evergreen Cemetery in Everett, Washington. So the next nurse was Evelyn Catherine Eckert, and she was a little bit hard to research because she went by her middle name. So things get a little confusing, and her parents were Hungarian immigrants. So there was some citizenship issues, and her mother sometimes spelled her name with a K, sometimes with a C. So this is where things can get a little difficult to research. But she was born on March 27th, 1921 in Pittsburgh. Then she had brothers that were twins born in 1919 and another brother, Emo, born in 1923. And then her mother died in 1928 from a ruptured appendix when Catherine, she went by Catherine as Evelyn, was 7 years old. So she graduated from the Taylor Allerice High School in Pittsburgh in 1939, enrolled in Southside Hospital School of Nursing. Shortly after graduating from nursing school, she enlisted in the Army on March 10th, 1943 at Indiantown Gap Military Reservation in Pennsylvania. So when she died, she also held the rank of a second lieutenant, and she is also buried at Arlington National Cemetery. So the next nurse is Ida Marie Greenwood. She was born April 2nd, 1918 in Terry, Montana. But she had three brothers, Harold born in 1914, Bert born in 1920, and another one born in 1926. So she was active in work in the community church Sunday school, Christian Endeavor choir, vacation Bible school, summer conference work, attended Terry grade school, graduated from Terry High School in 1936, took nurses training at Montana Deaconess Hospital in Great Falls, Montana, graduating in 1939. She worked at Deaconess Hospital as the head nurse in the obstetrical department. I'm sorry. And she enlisted in the Army in September of 1942 and was stationed in Hawaii for a period of time. She held the rank of second lieutenant at the time of the attack and is buried at the Prairie County Cemetery in Terry, Montana. So our last nurse also went by her middle name. So that Don had started doing some research on her for his 100th birthday project and got a little stonewalled because he couldn't figure out her first name because she was Dorothy Mildred Stanke, or to her friends, she was Millie. She was born April 5th, 1920 in Oakdale, Washington. She had two brothers, Willard, born in 1913, and Glenn, born in 1915. Two sisters, Lois, born in 1911, and Helen, born in 1923. She graduated from Colfax High School. And since childhood, she planned on being a nurse and graduated from St. Luke's School of Nursing in Spokane, Washington on May 25th, 1942. She served as class secretary and enlisted in the Army on May 18th, 1943, and received her commission as a second lieutenant the following day. She went through the same process. Like I said, all these nurses were part of the original crew. So she also was able to see her family for the 1944 Christmas holiday. Her parents received their last letter from her on April 30th, 1945, which was postmarked April 25th. So she wrote this letter 3 days before she died. Her parents were notified of her death on May 7th, 1945 by the War Department. She held the rank of first lieutenant. She's buried at the Colfax Cemetery in Colfax, Washington. And I think I do want to point out, when I was looking at these articles, it was the families were notified of the nurses' deaths just before Mother's Day. So these mothers found that their children had died just before Mother's Day. Wow,
that's really hard. But
it's harsh. So that's the six nurses that I have. So I hope I did this justice. Like I said, this was researching women is just a little bit different, and it's not always the same.
One thing that I found really fascinating is a lot of them graduated high school like right before the Great Depression. So
yes.
they were older than a lot of these men that you see dying in World War II. They're in 30s or 40s. And that's really interesting to see. I really wish we could find out why they decided to join the Army.
Well, I talked to Lee about that, and Lee had said a lot of times women join the military to escape a situation, maybe a bad home or a bad marriage or some sort of bad situation. I don't think you have to be a minority to have that reason, but some people do join the military to escape a situation.
I read a book about a man who joined the military because he was from it's called Appalachia or something. He was from generations of poverty. So he joined the military, and it really helped him just break that cycle and get out of that abuse and get out of all that, So it's interesting to see. I had not thought of the war was really disruptive, but in some ways maybe it was a good disruption to kind of break and give women and other minorities a chance to break the cycle of whatever was happening and change things. I hadn't really thought about that. Because another thing that's interesting is those women were all across the country. You kind of would expect, they're probably just the West Coast because they were West Coast ship, but they were all over the country that they came and did that. They're really fascinating to see that.
Well, that's usually what the military does. It's a mixing pot. That's what my dad talked about is, he was exposed to people from other parts of the country that he would have never seen had he stayed in Wisconsin. So he saw people from all walks of life.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, that's part of the reason why we're here in Kentucky is because my brother-in-law joined the military and my brother joined the Air Force. My brother-in-law joined the Army. and then they moved them all over the country, and then they settled on the East Coast. I mean, we're originally from the West Coast, and so we moved out here to be closer to my brother and my brother-in-law and my sister, and it's kind of funny. It's like, it's still happening with the military, just moving you all over the place and resettling things and getting you where you'd never think you'd be. And so I think that's an interesting part of the story of these women's lives is, coming from just like, I'm thinking like Montana in the 1930s was probably smaller than Montana is now, So
I'm sure it was pretty desolate.
Yeah. And so
she's
like,
a lot.
I don't know, plucked out of this, out into California and a totally different world, and then put on this ship and all the way across the world, seeing things she'd never seen before, with a group of women that are from all over the place, all over walks of life. And it's just fascinating to see how they, made things work and fought together, but also like, how they died together. It's tragic, but it's interesting to see what happened because of the war and like trickled down to everybody's life. I love that part about doing the research.
Well, if you want to, it's Doris Gardner. Doris Gardner. If you Google like USS Comfort, you'll run into Doris Gardner's website, and her daughter did it. As Doris apparently never threw anything away, and so they had a lot of her memorabilia and pictures and things and letters, and so it's a really good source if you want to get a feel, because it did seem like these nurses were very close to each other. And so that's how I found out about the one surviving nurse, and the crash of the plane threw her on top of a patient, and the patient died.
Wow, but she survived.
She survived. Excuse me. Yes, she survived, and unfortunately, the patient that she was thrown on top of died.
Well, so it was the surgical ward. So these patients were already like
they were in surgery. There were 4 doctors that were killed too.
Wow.
This crash killed 28.
Wow. But the ship itself was fine. It was just like damaged.
They were still able to travel under their own power, and they were escorted to Guam.
Oh, okay.
For repairs and to bury the dead.
So they were off the coast of Okinawa, then obviously treating men who were fighting.
Right.
In Okinawa.
Yeah, they were. The battle for Okinawa started on April 1st, and so they were treating the wounded as they left, and so this is when the attack happened. There's just a lot of facets to this story once you start digging into it, because this Too Close for Comfort book talks about this was supposed to be retaliation for a Japanese hospital ship that was torpedoed by the Americans. So if you start looking at that sub-commander, he had 2 Navy crosses. He was a very aggressive submarine commander. And so like I said, there's a lot of facets to this. But I should say that Harold Foltz was not the commanding officer at the time of this incident. He had left 2 weeks before. So they had a different commanding officer, and his last name was Tooker. And I can't remember his first name, but his last name was Tooker. Tooker.
So, and this is just me being naive, but did a military hospital ship, did the Navy hospital ships have any kind of weaponry to defend themselves?
Nope, none, zero.
And they're
not allowed by the Geneva
either.
Convention. They are not allowed to carry any defense, any guns. They have nothing. They're a hospital ship. They're a non-combatant.
So that when they saw the plane coming, there really was nothing they could have done.
No. Actually, they hit him at night. The ship was lighted. And so that's why the pilot used the Red Cross as a target.
Wow. So, I mean, there's not a lot of these instances in the war, right, where they attacked the hospital ships.
No. There are close calls. They're in a combat zone. There are close calls where you read about, even the Comfort here had a few close calls, but not. This was any time that it saw any actual damage.
Wow. That's really interesting. Like from the perspective, like a parent thinking, oh, my daughter's out there doing, serving in the war, but she's on a hospital ship. So like the odds of them, getting in an accident are not very high, so I think it's really been a shock to the whole, anytime someone passes away, it's a shock, but it's like, I think it probably even more so. It's like, wait, how does this happen? You're on a hospital ship and this happens.
Yeah. So, but another interesting thing I wanted to point out too is when I was researching this, is the word kamikaze was never used in any of the newspaper descriptions of what happened. It was always, it was just referred to as a Japanese suicide plane. So where does the term kamikaze come from? When did we start using that?
Yeah. It would like later in the war when it started happening more often, or,
Well, this was already April of 45, late April. So the war is coming to an end. So when did this morph into using the word kamikaze to describe this type of attack? Because the Japanese referred to these pilots as a special attack force. They didn't call them kamikaze pilots. They were just referred to the special attack force.
Wow, I did not know that. That is interesting. I wonder if maybe someone will send us email and be like, hey, this is when it happened.
Yeah.
Give us a comment.
Yeah, this is. So I thought that was interesting while I was researching this and reading newspaper articles from the time and those sorts of things. I thought were interesting to pass along to the listeners out there.
That's one of the things that I think is going to be so fun when the Arlington Project is done, is just the amount of really fascinating stories that are going to be coming to the light, because these Arlington buried, have they've obviously done something to be buried at Arlington, right? So I think you're going to see some more of these really interesting stories come to fruition as we get more of these stories done.
Yeah. How is that project coming? If you want to give it a little plug and get some people interested in, they want to research something, and I know we're a little behind from what I'm understanding.
Thank you so much for taking your time to listen to this episode of the podcast. A few things to be aware of. We are in the middle of our Arlington project. It's a national project. We're trying to get all of the World War II buried in Arlington, a story, and our app, so that any one of the millions of people who visit Arlington every year can actually see a picture or read a story of those that they visit. And it's a really awesome project, so we're going to have some great content. So if you're interested in that at all, check us out at www.storiesbehindthestars.org and click the volunteer button to join the Star Corps and become one of our writers. Another thing, I have not been able to launch these podcasts at a weekly basis as I used to be, for myriad of reasons. Mostly my 2-year-old stopped taking a nap, so there went my volunteer time. So if you subscribe, you'll get these episodes when they launch. And if you want to help us fund a lot of our back-end things that we have to pay for, like the website and the VPN, we've created a Patreon account where you can go check that out, become a Patreon member, and support us that way to help us pay some of the fees that are associated with running a big project like that. So we appreciate all of our volunteers. We appreciate everything that you've done for us, and hope to see you next episode.